Somewhere at the bottom of a lake in South Wales, buried under 19,000 years of quiet sediment, sat the answer to a question archaeologists thought they had already settled. Exactly when did people first come back to Britain after the ice finally started to retreat? The textbook answer had a specific date attached to it for years, repeated in paper after paper, taught as settled fact. That date was wrong by about 5 centuries, and the evidence that proved it wasn't found in a cave, a tool, or a bone. It was found in mud. To understand why this matters, you have to picture Britain at the peak of the last ice age, roughly between 29,000 and 19,000 years ago. Vast ice sheets covered much of the northern hemisphere, swallowing most of what is now Britain under a landscape of frozen desolation. Uninhabitable for humans or almost anything else that needed more than a few weeks of thaw to survive. As that ice slowly began retreating, the land didn't simply warm up once and stay that way. According to researchers, the climate across northwest Europe swung between cold and warm conditions on at least 2 separate occasions, each shift unfolding over the course of decades rather than centuries. Brief windows opening and closing again before anyone could fully settle in. The first of those transitions, during what's called the late Upper Paleolithic, roughly 14,000 to 11,000 years ago, is exactly the period this new research zeroes in on. This wasn't even the first time humans had tried living in Britain. Earlier, much older waves of hominins had occupied parts of the region for hundreds of thousands of years before this, only to be repeatedly driven out again whenever the ice inevitably returned. Britain, throughout most of its deep prehistoric past, functioned less like a permanent home and more like a temporary tenancy, occupied whenever conditions allowed and abandoned the moment they didn't. The specific migration this new research examines wasn't humanity's first attempt at the region. It was one particular, pivotal moment in a much longer, repeated pattern of arrival and retreat. For years, the standard model assumed that major warming across northwest Europe happened around 14,700 years ago, a benchmark largely built around ice core records pulled from Greenland. Specifically, a well-documented climate signal researchers call GE1. Britain's own repopulation was assumed to have followed shortly after that same continental timeline, once conditions warmed enough to support human life again, treated as a simple regional echo of a much larger, well-studied event happening further north. It was a reasonable assumption, built on the best evidence available at the time. It was also built on dating techniques that, decades ago, simply weren't precise enough to catch a 500-year discrepancy hiding in plain sight, waiting for better tools to notice it. The correction came from an unlikely source. Llangorse Lake, also known by its Welsh name, Llyn Cyffredin, the largest natural lake in mid and South Wales, sitting quietly inside the Brecon Beacons National Park. Lakes like this one function as extraordinarily patient record keepers. Layer after layer of sediment settles to the bottom year after year, undisturbed, preserving a continuous timeline of exactly what the surrounding environment looked like at any given moment, untouched by erosion, flooding, or the kind of disturbance that scrambles evidence on dry land. In this specific case, that undisturbed record stretched back a remarkable 19,000 years. A single unbroken column of evidence sitting quietly beneath the water the entire time, waiting for someone to actually pull it up and read it properly. A team led by researcher IP. Matthews, working alongside colleagues including Adrian Palmer at Royal Holloway, University of London, pulled a detailed core of that ancient mud and began reading it layer by layer. Their key tool for reconstructing temperature wasn't ice, tree rings, or even pollen alone, although fossil pollen played a supporting role throughout the analysis. It was chironomids, the fossilized remains of tiny, non-biting midge larvae, a family of insects so sensitive to water temperature that different species thrive at extremely specific, Well-documented temperature ranges, narrow enough that finding the right species in the right layer works almost like reading a label. By identifying which chironomid species dominated each individual layer of sediment, researchers can reconstruct summer temperatures for that exact moment in time with genuinely impressive precision, essentially turning a lake bed into a thermometer that's been quietly recording data for millennia. One tiny insect at a time. What that thermometer revealed was a sharp, unmistakable jump in southern British summer temperatures, rising from a chilly 5 to 7 degrees Celsius up to a considerably more livable 10 to 14 degrees Celsius. The kind of shift that turns a barely survivable landscape into genuinely productive grazing territory within a single human lifetime. Combined with recalibrated radiocarbon dates and lake chemistry data pulled from the same core, the team pinned this specific warming event to approximately 15,200 years ago, roughly 500 years earlier than the older Greenland-anchored estimate everyone had been working from for decades. That 5-century gap turns out to matter enormously because warmth alone doesn't explain why humans came back. Warmth explains why animals did, and animals explain why humans followed close behind. As temperatures climbed, herds of reindeer and wild horses began migrating steadily northward, chasing newly available grazing land, opening up across a landscape that, crucially, was still physically connected to the European mainland at the time, long before rising seas eventually carved out the English Channel and cut Britain off for good. Hunter-gatherer groups, according to archaeological evidence, were already tracking those same herds back into what's now southern Britain by around 15,500 years ago, arriving in the region even slightly before the sharpest temperature jump the lake sediment recorded, following the animals into territory that was already improving, rather than waiting patiently for it to become comfortable first. There's a broader detail buried in this specific correction that matters well beyond Britain alone. The new timeline shows this particular region warmed earlier than the well-known Greenland signal that so much of Northwest European chronology had quietly been built around for years, likely driven by regional shifts in Atlantic Ocean circulation and sea ice extent specific to the eastern North Atlantic, rather than mirroring conditions further north exactly the way older models assumed. In plain terms, for years researchers had been using one distant, extremely well-studied climate record as a stand-in for an entire region's timeline. And it turns out that stand-in wasn't quite telling the whole story for Britain specifically, missing a local wrinkle that only a much closer, much more localized record could actually catch. This kind of correction matters for more than just tidying up a timeline. It reshapes how researchers understand human resilience during one of the most unstable climate periods our species has ever navigated. A lesson in exactly how quickly small groups of hunter-gatherers could recognize and exploit a narrow, temporary opportunity the moment it appeared, without any way of knowing whether it would last 5 years or 5 centuries. None of this rewrites who these people were, or dramatically changes the broader arc of Ice Age Europe's slow thaw. What it does is quietly correct the calendar underneath one of the more consequential migrations in the deep human history of the British Isles. The moment people permanently, successfully returned to land that had been locked away under ice for millennia. This time for good. That correction didn't come from a newly unearthed skeleton, a dramatic cave painting, or a single dramatic artifact pulled triumphantly from the ground. It came from patiently reading 19,000 years of undisturbed lake mud, one microscopic insect fossil at a time, until the layers finally admitted that Britain had quietly opened its doors 500 years earlier than anyone had bothered to check. The unwritten record, some of history's biggest stories, were never written down at all. Subscribe and check out the rest of the channel, new lost chapters of history, going up every day.